That would be great. All right. Sorry about that. We wanted to record this so that we could share it with folks who weren't able to join us today. So as a reprisal, my name is Elizabeth Hansberg. I'm the director at People for Housing Orange County. I'm joined by my colleague, Natalia Hernandez, and our friends at United End Homelessness, Michael Shepard and Alejandro Santiago. And we're here today to talk over our lunch hour webinar about the housing and homelessness issues that are going to be on the November ballot. We're going to talk about questions that you can ask your candidates as you're looking at who to vote for your city councils. And we're also going to touch on some ballot measures that we want you guys to be aware of. And with that, I will allow my colleagues to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Thank you, Elizabeth. If you wouldn't mind, I know you're sharing your screen, but if you could pull that up as the full slideshow, wonderful. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are always excited to host and present on these types of topics because it's how we get the community more involved in this work and influence our civic leaders in the direction that we know leads towards solutions for affordable housing that serves so many people in our county, as well as the specific solutions that bring housing to end homelessness. And so always happy to work alongside People for Housing on that advocacy track and help bring you into this as well. If you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide.
So this issue is really timely. If you don't know, UCI does a poll and they release the results every August. And so the poll just came out about 2 Fridays ago, and it built on the poll from last year, which identified affordable housing and homelessness as the 2 top issues of concern among Orange County residents. And the poll for 2024 came out in 2 Fridays ago, and it says that people are thinking about leaving because of high housing costs. Of the residents that were surveyed, half are thinking about relocating because of high housing costs. Majority of those were people under 40, women, and members of the BIPOC community. And they dubbed those folks potential leavers. And 78% of those people that were the potential leavers said that it was the high cost of housing, and 76% said it was the high cost of living, which definitely includes housing. And one other sort of notable takeaway from that poll was that half of renters and 1 in 5 homeowners said that over the last year, they had been worried about making their housing payment. There was a great article in the LA Times, and also it was covered in the Orange County Register, and would encourage you to take a look at that. So let's talk about why we're here. This is the results from the 2023 poll that identified housing and affordable housing and homelessness as the 2 top issues. I don't know, Michael, do you want to say more about this? I know United Way played a role in publicizing this information.
That the 2023 Orange County poll identifying these 2 issues as the top ones that were on people's minds. And we know that if it's on people's minds, it should also be on our elected officials' minds. And that as an empowered electorate, we want to be asking the questions and that get at the heart of the things that matter to people. The ways that affordable housing and homelessness outpaced these other areas was something that was a surprise to the pollster. They've done this kind of poll in other parts around the country, and generally the most top of mind issues to people in other parts of the country are generally education and infrastructure, and that for Orange County it was a complete reversal. And so that that information combined with the information from the most recent poll about people who are considering moving out of Orange County really emphasizes that this is an issue that matters to people. And even more than just being an issue, an abstract issue that matters to people, it's something that affects so many of us personally. And whether that is ourselves and our experiences and relationships with folks experiencing homelessness, whether it's our own housing journey and precarity in housing. We can see some of the data on the next slide showing how much of an issue this is personally. That in that 2023 poll, 52% of renters had been worried about being able to pay their rent in the last year, 20% of homeowners being worried about being able to pay their mortgage, and the risk of losing their housing. And so if this is not you, it is people who are close to you, people who you care about. And again, that just underscores why this is an issue for us to be educated about and empowered to bring in our electeds. Next slide. Thank you. So the hour or so that we have together, we're going to be tracking through these areas, looking at background information on homelessness and affordable housing, and then looking at local impact and opportunities for both. We'll be talking about some ways that you can stay engaged, and then opening up to some Q&A. Our intent with this presentation is not just to tell you what's on the ballot for this one cycle, but to empower you with information about homelessness and affordable housing so that you can be better positioned for your local elections, local city councils, and continuing on as an advocate for both of these topics. So we will have some specific ballot measures, some examples of city council actions later on in the presentation, but kind of apart from being a typical legislative briefing, which would go point by point through proposed legislation, we want to set a foundation of education that you'd understand these issues and be able to share that with other people, bring them into this work as well. So to start with, understanding homelessness is an area where, if you go back to the last slide, please, an area where for many folks, even those who are active and civically minded, it is an empty space that we have projected our experiences, preconceptions, stereotypes, and honestly fear that housing is such an important part in all of our lives that the idea of lacking housing creates something kind of visceral in us. And that fear, it often gets projected onto people who are the most vulnerable in our communities, people who have lost safe and stable housing through a variety of means. And within that empty space, our civic leaders can often project a community's fears. And the responses to homelessness in that empty space can lead to unsafe, undignified, costly reactions instead of deliberate, intentional decisions about how we serve everybody in our community. Go ahead to the next slide. Part of this comes from thoughts about how California fits within the national political landscape. California does have an outsized proportion of people who are experiencing homelessness. A survey in 2023 counted just over 181,000 people experiencing homelessness. That's 28% of the national total, whereas California has only 12% of the general population proportion. A tremendous study out of UC San Francisco shed some more light on who these people are. I found that 90% of them were living in California prior to losing their housing. And this really cut against a pernicious myth that people are homeless in other parts of the country, and they are choosing to relocate and migrate to California for the weather or for policies or just because California is a place to be. That what this report found from surveys across the state, overwhelmingly, people who are unhoused in California are from California. And beyond that, 75% of people are still in the same county that they had a permanent address in before losing their housing. So not a major migration into the state, also not major migration throughout the state. That people generally stay in the communities that they are familiar with and aware of, and is a reason why this is a local issue in major ways. Next slide, please. Another area of misconception that we want to address has to do with the causes of homelessness. This is another empty area where we project a lot of preconceived notions. When surveyed here in Orange County, asking people who were experiencing homelessness, what were the causes of their homelessness, 74% of women and 57% of men referred to lack of affordable housing and job loss. The overwhelming expert testimony from people who are experiencing homelessness themselves point to these green shares of the pie about affordable housing and job loss. For women, the second leading cause that was identified was domestic violence. 5% had something related to drugs or alcohol. For men, family issues and health, really a combination here as the categories for second and third top areas. Family issues, health, reentry from jail or prison, drugs or mental health issues. And so understanding these causes should shift our perspective, and the information about these causes should shift how we are speaking about homelessness to our elected officials. That it is the stereotype of what causes homelessness can really amplify the kinds of reactions and the sense that people who are very vulnerable on our street are not safe. If you could go to the next slide. But when people are living outside, living in places that are not meant for habitation, they are exposed to traumatic circumstances. They suffer a tremendous amount of insecurity of their personal possessions, ID, documents. They have an increased likelihood of health conditions deteriorating. And if you could click again, are documented to report an experience of violence nearly 10 times that of the general population. So when folks are living outside, they are much more likely to be the victims of violence than someone within the general population. And so this knowledge should shift our understanding of public safety and who we are keeping safe and from whom, as well as reinforce the need for housing solutions to be where we are driving toward in our work together. So a question comes up about who is responsible then for addressing homelessness in Orange County. Orange County is a collection of 34 unique and distinct cities, as well as a board of supervisors, each of which have different political histories, different priorities, different resources, and all of that makes for a very challenging way to move forward with a solution that there is no mayor of Orange County. There is no singular entity and executive who can say how things are going to be. It takes collaboration from really everyone in our community. And so when polled in that same OC poll we referenced earlier from 2023, asking this question about who is responsible for addressing homelessness, 66 of people reported the board of supervisors and city councils, dropped down to 42% for nonprofit organizations, then advocacy groups and faith communities. And so folks are really looking toward our civic leaders to show some vision and some initiative to respond on homelessness. That it is not just a nebulous someone else out there, but that this should be information that drives our civic leaders to find ways to respond. A few other entities, if you want to click this slide, that are involved in addressing homelessness that are good to know about. The Commission to End Homelessness is an advisory board to the Board of Supervisors. They meet every other month to kind of look at the big picture and policy level of how we are responding. The Continuum of Care Board is an elected group who deal more in the policy funding and program side of addressing homelessness. Public housing authorities issue housing vouchers and support developments. CalOptima Health has become much more involved in supporting people who are currently unhoused or at risk of homelessness in getting connected with services. And then we at United to End Homelessness are doing work to help support all of the local nonprofit organizations, the regional groups and collaborative groups to do this work in more effective ways, and have some tremendous partners in that. Next slide. And so a question of how we solve homelessness is at the core of this work, that there are really two paths towards how we accomplish this. One is known as the treatment model, that is trying to address the individual and personal limitation that someone has to help them become housing ready. And it can be very challenging to do while someone is living in a crisis situation. It's what we have pursued for a long time here in Orange County. And unfortunately, it just does not have the scale that we need to really solve homelessness. The other path is what's known as the housing first model. It prioritizes to be in safe and stable housing, and then provide what is necessary for stabilization and thriving. It requires an alignment of resources as well as the development of housing, so that folks are not just stuck in place, but that they have the foundation and stability to really make meaningful change in their life. And the kinds of change that we're hoping to address in the treatment model can still happen when people have housing that is safe and stable. Click ahead. And ultimately, we look at homelessness as a housing problem. It is, and that with this as our clear vision on what the underlying issue is, it allows us to pursue solutions in a much stronger fashion. That what we are trying to accomplish is not one by one an individual, but we are trying to provide enough versatility and responsiveness to serve an entire county. Next slide. And so why are we here? Ultimately, we're here as United to End Homelessness. We hope that you're here on this call as well, because we believe we can solve big issues together. You can click ahead. And that together we have the breadth of experience, the breadth of talent, resources, and connection to our local cities to really do something big. And to do something like ending homelessness in a county of 3.5 million people is one that will take all of us pulling in the same direction. To solve big issues like affordable housing we'll need all of us pulling in the same direction. And so it's another reason why we're glad you're here, why we're always glad to partner with People for Housing as they take the baton and share a bit more about some of the general issues to understand and the context for affordable housing. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so as you heard Michael say, homelessness is in fact a housing problem, and we have a shortage of housing in Orange County and in California. And I want to just share some an illustration from SCAG. This data was provided to the SCAG board about 6 months ago, but I just thought it did such a great job of showing the cycles of building, right? In in sort of that post-World War II era, when we had, suburbanization and we had the federal government subsidizing, the building of housing. And we really did a great job in California of, yes, there were housing cycles, highs and lows, but really you saw that, basically through the early, late 80s, early 90s, we were building at a pretty good clip. And then it dropped off. And then after, where this blue arrow is showing, this is the Great Recession. And then it really dropped off, right? And we just have never recovered. We've never recovered at building at the rate that we needed to really address the growth in population. People continued to have children. People continued to move here, and the lack of housing to keep up with the population growth is ultimately what has gotten us, what has led to the shortage of housing. We know that if you're from here, there's a high chance that you want to stay. We have great weather. We have a lot of economic opportunity. Orange County is a great place to live. And we ultimately have more people here wanting to live here or coming here or wanting to stay than we have homes to put them in. And so the scarcity of that housing is, ultimately the driver of those high housing costs. And so the solution from our perspective is to build more housing across the continuum, right? permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, affordable housing, and definitely first-time home buyer housing for families that, you know, have grown up here and want to stay and raise their own families. So what do we have as far as, you know, what does the housing landscape look like today? Oh, excuse me, this is not good. Here we go. Predominantly single family zoning. We have a track record in California, you know, when most of that housing was being developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. California had land, and the ideal California lifestyle had everyone with, you know, 1 to 2 cars and a 1,500 to 2,000 square foot house on a 6,000 to 8,000 square foot lot. That was the California dream, if you will. And we built that way. And now we have chewed through the availability of greenfield development, and we don't have a lot of vacant land left. And so the continued expansion of our economy, especially in Irvine, and you know, having a lot of either, you know, national or regional headquarters here in Orange County, we have continued to attract people from all over the country and even all over the world to come in and live here. And it has caused the median home price in Orange County to skyrocket at a rate that far outstrips wages of, I guess, what I'll call sort of like, you know, the everyday people, you know, the civil servants, the nonprofit workers, teachers, you know, people that earn a modest wage, and that in other places that perhaps don't have the demand for housing that we have here in Orange County could live a fairly middle class life. It has caused a downward pressure. And those folks, those moderate income earners, are really occupying housing that could be occupied by, excuse me, lower income households, because we have not built that first level of home buyer housing. And so we see a disconnect between the housing that's available and the need in the community. And so we know that when you have a situation where people who have money are moving to a place, they will displace the people without. And so if we want to have an economically just place to live in Orange County where people who are from here can afford to stay, we have to build more housing. So let's ask the question, who's responsible for building housing? So it's a combination of different different levels of government. Ultimately, we do rely on the private market to deliver unsubsidized housing that isn't intended for a specific income group, but probably serves, you know, moderate income and above, or above moderate income. We do primarily rely on market rate housing developers. We also have in Orange County several big affordable housing developers and some smaller ones as well. And they are basically artificially no, I'm sorry, not artificially constrained. That's NIMBYism. Pardon me. The nonprofit development community that's building that affordable housing is really constrained by the subsidies that are available. And so when you have a project come forward, it's going to go out for tax credits. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 application rounds. So they could be waiting for several years, even if they have approval from the city council to build. It may take a while for them to get the tax credits needed. And so that prevents us from really building the amount of affordable housing that is needed in terms of, you know, the demand or the need. You know, and city and state government, right? State government is the one that directs those tax credits through the TCAC and CEDLAC committees. But city government has a lot to do with who gets to build what where, right? Local control, local land use policy. And so cities really have a role to play. They can make it easier or they can make it harder to build new housing, any type of new housing, but specifically affordable housing. A lot of times those nonprofit developers that are going after those tax credits to build, you know, they need to see, you know, the committees that are awarding those tax credits need to see some local money in the mix. And so cities' choice to allow it to be built and or to put some money towards the project has a lot to do with whether or not those tax credits are awarded. And so just keeping in mind that this is a combined effort, and it really takes everyone working together at all the levels of government and engaging with the market through the, both the for-profit or not, I'm sorry, through the market rate developers and the affordable housing developers to produce the housing that we need. So this is a diagram where we wanted to show sort of the path that a project goes through. So when a developer is coming, whether it's a market rate project or an affordable project, they start with planning staff. And then it sort of moves through this pipeline of different sort of eyes, I guess you could say. So they'll start to work with planning staff. They'll get a feel for what does the city want to see there. In some cities, they have what's called like a sunshine meeting or a community engagement meeting. And so the developer will come and they'll have a community meeting and they'll just kind of share what they're thinking and ask for feedback. Eventually, it works its way through city staff, through the community development director, through the city manager, and then ultimately it'll come to the planning commission. And the two places where your advocacy can be meaningful, definitely at the community meeting. If you can get in on that early conversation about what they're proposing, that's a great way to potentially shape a project, share what you'd like to see in your community, share that with your elected officials, because in this pathway, oftentimes a developer will try to meet with individual council members to get feedback because they know that at the end of this story, it's really the city council that's going to make that final determination. And they don't want to walk into that city council meeting not knowing what city council person X is going to say. They want to have had that conversation early in the process. But two places where you can truly lend support, right? Even if you're not shaping the project, but you're giving your elected officials or your appointed officials, in the case of the planning commission, the cover to make the hard decision, right? If everyone at the podium is saying, no, don't do this, we don't want this here, it's really hard for them to, do the right thing and facilitate the development of housing, which leads to an increase in housing availability, which is the end, that's the ultimate solution to homelessness is more housing. Your advocacy can play a huge role. And so in these last two boxes that you see here, the Planning Commission and the City Council, we spend a lot of time trying to mobilize folks, letting folks know about opportunities to be a support for the housing in their community. And we would invite you to join us. And I know Michael would agree with that as well. So let's talk about where we sit on in terms of, we are advocates for affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, all the way up to first-time homebuyer housing. We don't shy away from advocating for market rate projects, particularly the ones that serve that sort of, getting, families getting their foot on the rung of the ladder of home ownership, right? And I think we would agree that all of us that are doing this work in Orange County, we have a set of shared priorities, and we sometimes refer to them as the 3 Ps or the 4 Ps. We want to produce more housing, particularly affordable housing. We want to preserve the existing affordable housing that we have. That can look like many things, but it can look like a land trust. It can look like finding ways to restructure projects when the covenants are about to expire so that we can extend that affordability. We need renter protections for this liminal time when we don't have enough housing. We need to make sure that people are safe in their homes, that they have assistance to relocate if a relocation is necessary, and really just need to, it's way cheaper to keep somebody in their home than to try to move them from homelessness into housing. And that goes to the prevention, right? Again, keeping people in their homes.
And
So
now
this
we're going to
brings
shift gears and talk a bit more about what's happening locally. You can see we're planning open time for Q&A there at the end, so please be using the chat box if you have questions to share. That's going to be the best way for our team to kind of manage what's in there. If there's anything that comes up along the way, you'll also have our contact information if there's something specific that you want to follow up on about affordable housing or homelessness as well. But I want to turn to look at what homelessness looks like here in Orange County. From the most recent point in time count done in January and the report released in May, found that nearly half of the people who were surveyed were experiencing homelessness for the first time. And that this really speaks to that prevention piece, that to really address homelessness in a way that that will make a dent requires prevention. So it's not just how do we help people off the street once they're there, but how do we have those systems in place for affordability and some protections to prevent homelessness. Over half of people have family in Orange County, 43% have attended school here, 63% have worked here, really to match up with those California statistics that we mentioned earlier, that homelessness is not coming from some other place to us. If you go to the next slide, that folks report their last permanent address, 76% of people here in Orange County. So there's not a massive spillover from Los Angeles or from San Diego or the Inland Empire or other parts of the state. 76% of people were here in Orange County. 93% of people were already living in California prior to losing their housing. So this is not some external force, but these are things that are happening within our jurisdiction. You can see the breakdown on that slide as well of how people identify themselves in the north part of the county, the central part of the county, and then the south part of the county. The next slide. From that point in time count, we were able to count at that time 7,322 people without housing here in Orange County. You can see those numbers on the map. That aligns pretty well with our general population distribution. So it's not to say that the South is doing a great job on ending homelessness, but that there are fewer people there to start with. You can also see in those colored circles different groups of folks that we count because each of these groups have different needs, different solutions in how we pursue ending homelessness. You can move to the next slide. Overall, we saw a 28% increase since the 2022 count and a 7% increase over the last 5 years. The folks who are unsheltered represent about 57% of this total count, and nearly 2/3 of those folks are chronically homeless, folks who are the most vulnerable in our community that have been unhoused for a year or more, and they have a disability. And so that is information that helps us to understand who is among our communities experiencing homelessness so that we can design the right solutions to respond. As we look at housing as the primary cause within someone's homelessness, when we look over the last 20 years in California, we see how this orange line of rent has far outpaced the gray line of wages. I know Elizabeth has alluded to some of that as well, but this is the situation that accelerates people experiencing housing insecurity and accelerates people experiencing homelessness. It also represents the gap of when people lose their housing, how difficult it can be to regain that. So to think that someone can just jump back into housing quickly is a much harder proposition. And sometimes this data can hit really hard for people that have not needed to pay rent in a long time. Maybe you've been in a fixed rate mortgage or you've had stable rent. That this dramatic change for some folks that we talk to when we give our regular class, they're not really aware of this housing reality until their grown children are trying to move back to Orange County. And kind of it's a kind of a moment of clarity that of how expensive things are. Move to the next slide. Not that we need to belabor the point. I think we all know that this is an expensive place to live, but what is considered fair in our market is that a 2-bedroom apartment can rent for just over $2,500. And so the household income needed to support that tops 6 figures. Someone would need to be making over $48 an hour to afford that, or 3.2 minimum wage jobs within the household. And so this reality is one that many people are facing to remain housed, but also as they're seeking to regain housing. Next slide. And all of this impacts how we are trying to get people out of homelessness. That when housing is our goal, that the effectiveness of our system is in how many people are able to regain a safe and stable place to live. At the same time we did the point in time count, we looked at the Yale Navigation Center and Bridges at Kramer Place and What that found was that 72% of people who were there had completed all of the necessary steps to be eligible for housing. They filled out the paperwork, they had their documents in order, were connected to a housing navigator. They had done everything that was asked of them to be ready for a housing opportunity. Yet only 1 out of every 12 people were connected to housing. So it's not a matter of people not wanting housing, not looking for that opportunity, but that our housing opportunities are so hard to find. And that with that in mind, it's something that is important for our civic leaders to understand, that people might be doing everything that we ask of them, but they're still not able to make that progress because of things that are outside of their control. Next slide. And ultimately, what we are pushing for is the kind of housing safety net that represents this total span of work, that we are able to prevent homelessness for people who are housing insecure, that can be the biggest investment in this work to end homelessness. But that if someone does experience homelessness, we have the right combination of outreach, shelter, and services so that someone's experience of homelessness is brief, that they are connected to housing as quickly as possible, and that we have different options for that. We go into much more detail about these different options in our Homelessness 101 class that we'll talk about in a moment. And then the last part is that we are supporting people as they regain housing to remain housed and thrive. That in all of these pieces together, we want to be thoughtful at the scale that we need to solve this issue, that we are addressing it with the right resources at each step along the way. Go ahead. And then this is how we move towards our solution, that we are clear that homelessness is caused by a housing crisis and the lack of community support. That while there are many ways we can respond to homelessness, we know that housing first is the only one that works. It is the model that is shown in our community as well as other places across the country, that this is the model to pursue. It takes work to align the resources and political will behind that. And that's where housing advocacy is fundamental to achieve this, that it is not something that can be accomplished by one person on the board of supervisors saying this is what we're going to do. It takes leaders in all parts of our community. And so it takes citizens and advocates and people who are engaged in all parts of our community. And that together we move towards those solutions. Go ahead. I want to talk briefly about one of those types of solutions that is less known to the general public because it is specifically a homelessness solution. And that is what's called permanent supportive housing. And within supportive housing, it's an option that's targeted towards folks who are the most vulnerable, folks who are chronically homeless and experienced homelessness for a year or more. Go ahead to the next slide. We've done this here in our community in some very creative ways. I'm going to be going quickly through it, but we spend much more time on our Homelessness 101 looking at these. If you want to click ahead. This church property, click ahead, transformed into Legacy Square in downtown Santa Ana. Click ahead. City Hall in San Juan Capistrano. The city was able to negotiate with the developer for a brand new city hall. And on the next slide, you see, on the next click, you'll see on the backside 48 units of housing to match San Juan Capistrano beautifully. Next slide. In Costa Mesa, Motel 6 that was remodeled, renovated, transformed into Mesa Vista apartments for folks who have survived homelessness. And in each of these areas, they are folks who, it was the result of folks who were advocating to their city council. We want to see this kind of solution here. We want to see folks with a more dignified and safe place to live that help to bring these solutions to the forefront. Next slide. And so with housing as our goal, we want to be really clear that the way that we get there is not just by professional community organizers or professional lobbyists or professional social workers. We get there through housing advocacy, and that brings everyone on board to have a role to play. The last thing that I want to share about, next slide, has to do with a recent Supreme Court case decision known as Grants Pass versus Johnson. In this case, it overturned some of the precedent that was affecting how we responded to homelessness, and it really put the responsibility right back onto local city councils and local county governments in how we will respond to homelessness. And so as we are as we're getting more involved in advocacy, we're right back to that city by city, community by community solution to help us have the kind of housing that we need. We'll return back to how we can do some of that advocacy in a moment, but want to pass the baton back over to Elizabeth to share some more about affordable housing.
So this begs the question, how much housing does Orange County need? If you have been with us on past webinar events or joined us in person at our meetups, you've undoubtedly heard us talking about housing elements and the 6-cycle regional housing needs allocation, otherwise known as RHNA. And for the 6th cycle, which started in 2021 and runs through 2029, Orange County, all the cities together plus the unincorporated county, was our goal was 183,000 new homes, and 75,000, over 75,000 of those are needed to address the low and very low income levels. And that would be anyone, or for a family of 4, anyone earning 80% of the area median income. And I believe for 2024, the area median income is it's either 109,000 or 119,000. I can't remember if it's got a 9 in it, for a family of 4. So you're looking at, upwards of $80,000 for a family of 4 is considered low income. We currently, as we've been saying, don't have enough housing affordable to low income residents. We're struggling to find housing affordable to moderate income residents. That's the 80% of area median income through 120% of area median income. And so for us to make progress, for there to be homes to place people who are exiting homelessness into, so that more than 1 in 12 people can move from a shelter and into housing, we have to build more housing over the next 8 years. And that is what the RHNA is attempting to get at. Okay, so let's talk about the policy changes that we would like to have on the platforms, included among the points that we see candidates running on. As Michael said, the grants pass decision really focused the solutions to homelessness, how cities are going to deal with homelessness. They now have much more leeway to clear encampments, but they also have, that can swing back the other way. They can even in some ways do more, right? It was a loosening of the restrictions. And in as much as there is an opportunity to do more harm, there is also an opportunity to do as much or more good through local policy making. So we're just going to touch on 3 things you can be looking for in the platforms of your city council candidates, things you can ask them about when you're reading their websites and they're laying out, the policies that they're running on, the things that they're concerned about. Look for these, please look for these policies and see if there's any mention of them as part of the solution that these electeds could get behind. The first one is zoning, right? Why am I talking about zoning? You wouldn't necessarily think of that as an affordable housing policy. Oh, but it is. So the zoning that is coming now, many cities are in the process of changing up their zoning to match the housing element that they have just completed within the last year. And the zoning really is the implementation of the housing element. And as the cities are going through this process, they're identifying sites that can be increased in what we refer to as density, in terms of how many units can be placed on a parcel. And that's measured in dwelling units per acre. And in as much as zoning is, commercial here, industrial there, residential here, within residential, we have low density residential, medium density, higher density, and really making room for more high density or higher density housing is part of the solution. So much so that state law says that if you're an urban community like we are in Orange County, that the minimum density that you can zone for is 30 dwelling units to the acre. That's considered the minimum if a city wants to count a site as being quote unquote affordable housing, in that bank of sites available for affordable housing, it has to be a higher density site. But the reality is we really need more like 60 dwelling units to the acre. Some cities have gone as high as 90 or 100 dwelling units to the acre so that they have capacity if sites don't fully develop, in the pipeline, so they don't have to do future rezoning. But welcoming more denser housing, multifamily housing, whether it's income restricted, subsidized, affordable housing, or just townhomes rather than pushing for single family homes. All of that is part of the solution. An inclusionary housing policy. These are really good for creating mixed income communities. It's basically a policy where the city will say, for this, they'll have a percentage, for new development, 10% of it needs to be set aside for low and moderate income folks. It can be a tool that NIMBYs use to shut down housing. If a city's policy is, I'll use the word draconian, right? If they're saying, 25% of housing has to be affordable, that is going to shut down development. There isn't going to be a project that can carry that cost. And so you'll see no housing. And so 25% of zero is still zero. So this is definitely a policy that needs to be sort of calibrated to the local housing market. It's much easier to implement over in a rental type of product, right? Looking at multifamily rental versus home ownership. It's a lot more costly. And one of the major differences between affordable housing units that are inclusionary versus, say, one that is done by like a nonprofit like a Jamboree or a National Community Renaissance, is that there is no subsidy on an inclusionary unit. These are units that are literally a cost to the project. And so the policy has to be well-defined and in place when the developer is working out the financing for their project so that they know what's coming. It doesn't work to do your pro forma in a certain way and then you get to council and they're, oh, by the way, could you put some affordable housing in? That, the piecemeal, case by case basis. If a city wants to have an inclusionary housing policy, it's best to go ahead and pass that policy so that everyone knows what the rules are or everyone knows what the expectations are from the get-go. That is definitely leads to that certainty that developers are looking for. Usually they will have as an alternative the option of paying what's called a fee in lieu. And that money can be used, if you collect those funds over, over several developments, the city can use that money. They can create like a quote unquote, a trust fund or just an affordable housing fund. And then they can use that money as the local match that I mentioned earlier for a tax credit project, right? So then the city will have funding. And since 2011, we have not had redevelopment money. And so cities have really been strapped for, where are we going to find funding? They don't want to take it out of the general fund. Where are we going to find funding to commit to affordable housing?
Elizabeth, if I could pause you for a second,
Sure.
we're running a bit short on time, and I know we'd love to talk more about some of the issues and ways to get involved. Do you mind if I skip you over this one and we talk a little bit more about Prop 5 and the significance that has on affordable housing?
Sure, absolutely.
Great.
I'll just say something that's a newer policy that you can ask is how your council members feel about housing on church property. There's been some new laws passed. So I'll just throw that out as the third policy to be looking for. So let's talk about what you're going to see on the November 2024 ballot. The most significant thing that I think will be on the ballot is Prop 5. What is Prop 5? Prop 5 is a proposal to change the voter threshold for cities or counties or the state to issue affordable housing bonds. And instead of it being what it is currently, 2/3 of voters or 67%, it would align it to 55%, which also happens to be the threshold for school bonds. So if you're not familiar with a bond, it's basically a way for government at any level to borrow money out of the capital market. And it enables but in order to issue that debt, right, in order for the local government or state government to go into debt, it has to have currently 67% of voters approval. And there have been multiple cases, particularly in Northern California, where they've gotten to 62%, 63%, 64%, but it has failed to meet that threshold. So this is a proposal to bring affordable housing and the infrastructure to support it, to bring that in line with school bonds. And I'm a supporter of this proposition because I see housing, particularly affordable housing, as part of community infrastructure. Same way we talk about schools or roads, having that availability of housing is really important. And I would refer you for a deeper explanation to this Cal Matters. Cal Matters is a nonprofit journalism that does public policy for California, and they have a great explainer series of all the different propositions that are going to be on the ballot. And then, okay, that's the video. Okay, why am I emphasizing this? I'm emphasizing this because in that 2023 poll that UCI did last year, that was redundant, we see strong support across the political spectrum for a local housing bond at the county level. If anything came out of that 2023 poll, it was two things. Number one, that residents are concerned about this. The issue is top of mind. They're looking to local government leaders, city councils, and county supervisors to solve this problem, and they're willing to spend money on it. And not just the liberal end of the political spectrum. We saw feedback from people that identified themselves as conservatives who still had a strong support to float a bond to address affordable housing and homelessness. And so that is a key takeaway. So why would we need to, so if we can pass Prop 5, it could help us in Orange County to do a local housing bond. And I think that's going to be a key to addressing the need for affordable housing and homelessness, because it will give us a local source of funding. We don't have to wait on the state. I mean, it's always going to be, the 7-layer cake of funding, but it would give us some local funds that we could put towards local priorities. I want to just go over a couple of quick ballot measures. Both Yorba Linda and the city of Cypress have ballot measures related to implementing their housing element. They all have what I refer to as ballot box zoning, which I think is bad policy. Nevertheless, with those measures in place, they have to get voter approval to implement their housing element. So their housing elements have gotten approval from the state, but it's all hinged upon making sure that they have permission from the local the local electorate to implement it. And the way that this gets shared is that, if you don't vote for it, or if you live in one of these cities and if you don't vote for it, that, we're going to lose local control and the state will step in and the builder's remedy will apply. And there's some truth to that, but we have to keep in mind that making decisions about land use at the ballot, there's a gap in people's understanding. And so all the planning processes that the city goes through kind of get tossed out the window when you're asking, a group of people who may or may not fully understand all the implications of what they're saying yes to. And so just keep in mind that if your city has gotten to the point where they've passed a housing element, support for that housing element could be key in making progress towards building more housing. And then I'll just touch on this. I don't know if you guys have heard about this one, but so Huntington Beach has come forward with an idea that any development, right? And it doesn't just affect residential, it affects businesses. It's anything that would require CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, anything that would have a negative impact that couldn't be addressed to basically neutralize it has to get approved by the voters. And they're doing this under the guise, I believe, of environmentalism. But really, I think it's more about shutting down development, right? Making it harder to develop new housing opportunities. And so just scrutinize the ballot measure, right? And if you're in a city, keep a lookout for how your elected officials want to make decisions, right? I would argue that we elect them to lead, right? And so making these tough decisions, the city of Newport Beach recently made the decision not to put their housing element on the ballot because if it didn't pass, they risked falling out of compliance. And so they took the bold step of saying, you know what, as the city council, we can approve this, we can make these changes, and we're going to go ahead and implement them, trusting that the folks that voted for us wanted us to make these hard choices for them. And I think that is a much more functional way to go about the planning process. So yeah, just pay attention to what is on your ballot locally. And if you have questions or you want to, seek further guidance, I would say we're happy to talk with you. United to End Homelessness would talk to you. I'm sure the Kennedy Commission could weigh in. There's lots of resources if you have questions about what's showing up on your ballot in October.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We are always too optimistic about how much information we can pack into
Indeed.
into the time. So I just want to share a little bit about how you can stay engaged. Next slide. That the advocacy work that both of our organizations are involved with are really about building community support for solutions. That we're not just trying to say there's a problem or do something about it without trying to also bring along community members and civic leaders to be a part of the response. And a big part of that, you can go back to the last slide. A big part of that is also about countering opposition and really apathy. That for a lot of folks, if they've got their housing secured, affordability might not be something they think of. But it's important for all of us to come into this work and advocate out of our own experiences, our own resources and networks. And that's what we would love to talk to you about more. We'll send out some notes about some of the specific ways you can do that. But I would encourage you to stay connected with People for Housing OC, with United to End Homelessness. If any of these events, if any of this call has sparked something in you about how can I get involved in my city, how can I learn more, we want to connect you with other local people to do that. If you wouldn't mind skipping way down to our contact information, we can share that. You all can get a speed glimpse of what we're planning to share more of. The email addresses that for Elizabeth and myself, that we are happy to follow up more. We'll stay on the line for a bit for some Q&A. I think it's the next slide with our email addresses. If there's more that you need to follow up with about us specifically, if there's an area that we don't have a chance to clarify a question on, but we also want to thank everyone so much for joining us for the short hour today for your lunch. We look forward to finding ways to stay connected with you and being part of empowering our electorate in Orange County to make a difference on affordable housing and homelessness. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Elizabeth for any final things you want to say, or if you want to look into any of the questions that we have.
Yeah, so I'm happy to stay on, but understand if folks need to jump off, please feel free to do that. I do want to take time for Q&A, so we can afford to spend a little bit of time. If anybody wants to come off mic, I know we had one of our staff members, Natalia, answering questions in the chat, but if you had anything that didn't get answered or a specific question that you want to come off mute, I think we're few enough that we can afford to do that.
Elizabeth, if you want to address, there were 2 questions in the chat. If you want to do those first,
Okay.
From Daniel, if you want to read that one with his disclaimer, and then there's another one by Miles Yorman.
Okay.
If you want to read those 2.
Okay, the density question is complicated. Wood frame construction can only realistically deliver perhaps up to 40 dwelling units per acre. And even to do that typically requires some other concessions such as parking or open space or both. Does any of the pending legislation include incentives to make higher densities possible? That's a great question. I think there's a bill right now from Senator Caballero that gets at putting 10 units, the possibility of doing 10 units on a vacant lot in a single family zone. So that's the one that I'm most aware of. I'm not aware of something that would go up to the level of 40 dwelling units or higher. But that's the bill from Senator, I think her name is Ana Caballero. She has a bill right now. It has not passed yet. It's still kind of making its way through. But there was an op-ed in the Orange County Register this morning about that bill. So if you are interested in that bill, I would encourage you to seek out that op-ed. And then the other question was, is there any realistic movement afoot for wholesale zoning reform in California? That is a great question. Before this year, I would have been more optimistic about it. Personally, what I saw from Senator Buffy Wicks's bill that was an attempt to quote unquote fix the builder's remedy was really coming from the fact that the local governments in her jurisdiction really were unhappy with the override that could happen with builder's remedy. And so this attempt to fix it was really in some ways more of an attempt to, neuter it. I won't say make it completely non-usable, but it was not a bill that I was pleased with when it came out. So I'm going to say no. And the reason I say that is because local governments are still very powerful, and as much as I think state government, folks in state government have the benefit of being a little more removed from the voter, local government really is, especially in cities where we've gone to districts, you're only answering to in some cities, you're only answering to 500 to 1,000 residents, right? In some of our smaller cities. And so I think there's going to be resistance to what is described as wholesale zoning reform. At the same time, there are movements. Strong Towns is a great example. The Strong Towns, if you go to strongtowns.org. So I would say there's movements from sort of a grassroots and, not led by government, right? It's led by people. And if we can continue to implement those principles, I think that we can get there, but I don't think it's going to come. It's definitely not going to come from local elected leaders. And I think, in the times when I've seen it attempted at the state level, it's been a tough sell. So I think it's on us to continue to look at the guy that founded Strong Towns, Chuck Marone, just wrote a book called The Housing Trap. Talks a lot about how incremental development is more economically sustainable for cities. And I think ultimately it's better received in the community because it happens on a more not to be redundant, but it happens on a more incremental basis, and it's small changes over time rather than big changes of, going from a vacant parking lot to a 7 or 8 story building, which seems to be the thing that most people have found objectionable, is just these overnight changes that they don't recognize. Whereas I think some of the more, maybe you've heard of it called gentle density or incremental housing or infill. I think in some communities, there is more of an appetite for that type of housing than the higher density stuff. But the movement to do wholesale zoning reform is going to come from advocates, right? It's not going to come from government. You mentioned what sounds like SB 9. Is that correct? Thanks for the answer. SB 9 is, yes, SB 9 is the lot split bill to make it feasible for people that have larger lots to subdivide their lot and then build 2 units on each half of that lot. So you can go from a lot that could have 1 house or 1 house and an ADU to a duplex on each if you wanted. The issue with SB 9 is that cities have to opt in. And so most cities have chosen not to opt in. And so it hasn't been as useful as it would have been as, say, like an SB4, which is just implemented across the state. There's no opting in or out. So that's been one of the sort of, I think one of the things making SB9 not as effective is that cities have to sort of have buy-in, and there's not a lot of cities that have support from their residents to densify single family zone neighborhoods. Anybody else want to ask a question?
Just want to say thank you again to everyone for joining us. And thank you people for housing, for getting the ball rolling on this. And from United to End Homelessness and Orange County United Way, look forward to how we can stay connected in the future.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody. We hope to see you at a planning